Hey, how many of y'all have already written down 2019 accidentally? Anybody? A few of you? Oh man, you guys are on it. It feels so weird to write the numbers 2020 down. And as Travis said earlier, welcome to the first worship service of your decade. That's pretty huge. It sounds epic, doesn't it? It sounds even more epic when you put it that way. I don't know if you're like me, but I find myself feeling awkward about a new year in the sense that, I kind of don't set resolutions necessarily anymore, but I do think about the new year and think about goals, and I think about what could happen, what should happen, what needs to happen. I do a little bit of looking back too and get a little reminiscent and nostalgic. Overall, both of those things together cause me to feel just a smidge depressed. It's just not a real fun thing. I say, hey, this year's over and this year's is coming. And, it's like, so there's something about that doesn't get me as stoked maybe as it should. But I will stand before you and say that when I don't think about Bill Clark and I think about Hickory Grove, it shifts a little bit for me. Like, I really, really am pumped about this new year. In a few moments, I want to lay out some things that I believe God is going to do in 2020. But before I do that, let me back up. 2019, if I could, and I've told this to several people already over and over again, if I could sum up what God did and what we experienced as a church in 2019, if I were to sum it up in 2 words, I would use the word great things. God has done great things in the church, through the church, in people's lives that have come and been a part of this journey. And I could go through a lot of examples. I don't want to go through all those details, but one of the first ones I think of is the fact that we had 72 people declare their faith through baptism in 2019. Isn't that great? So awesome. And so that's great. I mean, we've gotten to see some really cool things. God has just enriched and enlarged our partnerships in the community. I will never forget the kind of Easter we had in 2019. We all wore these blue shirts that said second best Easter ever. And we actually raised some funds to pay down the school lunch debt in Kenton County, to pay some of it down, a big chunk of it down. And just things like that, being on mission. We actually sent teams to Mazatlan, Mexico, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And those are just barely scratching the surface. I love the stories of individuals and families whose lives have changed and been transformed by what they've experienced with God. And we just have so many stories of that that we know of from a staff standpoint. When I look back, God has done great things in 2019. When I look ahead, and this is the words you're going to hear me say over and over again throughout this entire year, Lord willing, and that is the words all things. 2020 is going to be the year of all things. And what do I mean by that? This truth. All things are possible with Him. All things are possible with Him. We've seen Him do great things. And some of those great things that I think of in my mind personally were somewhat impossibilities, or at least they could have been. And that's what I want us to be thinking about today and for throughout this year is what impossibilities are you facing right now? Maybe it's just one, maybe it's several. What looks to be an impossible situation or circumstance? And have you given that over to the Lord? And do you know that this God that we worship, that we sing songs about and to, that we gather together to every Sunday in this place, that the whole reason we do all that is because we supposedly believe that God is pretty big. We supposedly believe that He's pretty important and that He can do anything. But I believe that's going to be tested in 2020. Do we actually believe this or not? Do we actually believe He's as big as we say He is? Is He as awesome as the lyrics that we sing? Is this God that is worthy of us chiseling out an hour or two of our Sunday mornings every week and coming and worshiping Him? Is this God capable of doing the thing that we think is impossible or not? That's what I'm looking forward to seeing happen. I believe we're going to see and celebrate God doing the impossible in this year. And I'm really, really excited about that. So to sort of help us wrap our minds around this a little bit, I want to share with you an encounter that Jesus had. And we find it in Mark chapter 9. I'm going to read starting at verse 14 in a moment, but let me kind of set up what's happening. In fact, I think it's pretty cool to see what happens right before this. You may have heard of this happening, but the Bible talks about an incident that happened where Jesus took 3 of the men who had left everything to follow him, Peter, James, and John. He leads them up on a mountain, and he transfigures. He transforms in front of them to where what they see is not the exact same Jesus they had been seeing. Instead, it's the glorified heavenly version of Jesus. So he reveals his glory to these 3 men. And even as I say it, I wish I could give you more details. Like, it was pretty awesome. Peter did not want to leave the mountain. He wanted to build a shelter and stay there. That's how awesome it was. That's pretty miraculous, pretty cool. In Mark's account, you even hear him speak of this voice of God the Father saying, "This is my son, do what he says," kind of an affirming moment. I mean, all this is happening on this mountain with just these 3 men. And if that weren't enough, 2 other guys show up for the meeting, Moses and Elijah, and they're having this conversation with Jesus. And I just picture Peter, James, and John just being like this, like, can you believe we get to see this? This is crazy. So they had this amazing experience on this mountaintop. And now Jesus is leading Peter, James, and John to rejoin the other disciples, 9 other guys of the 12 that had left everything to follow Jesus. And wouldn't you know, this is what happens. What you're about to see that happens, it's kind of what, if you're like me, this is like what happens when something great happens. And I feel like I'm a pretty optimistic guy, but every now and then something really good happens. My mind goes to this very like pessimistic place, like, oh no, that was too good of a week. I bet this week's going to be a bad week. You ever do that? And maybe that's, if you've been looking back at 2019, looking ahead to 2020, maybe that's your story. You're like, 2019 is great. I'm really worried about 2020 because it was such a good year. Or maybe it's vice versa for you. Like, it can't get any worse than 2019. 2020 is going to be awesome. I don't know what your perspective is, but it just seems like sometimes right after a mountaintop experience, we experience what these guys experienced. Let me read it to you. Verse 14 of Mark 9. It says, and when they came to the disciples, so they've been on this mountain, Jesus and Peter, James, and John come to the disciples. They saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. Yay! Happy New Year! Now this happens, right? After that great mountaintop experience, this is so wonderful. We're seeing the glory of Jesus. We want to build a shelter and stay on this mountain. And they come back to this. People arguing with their fellow disciples. Goes on to say, and immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. So they were glad to see Jesus. And he asked them, what are you arguing about with them? And someone from the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And he answered them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, the disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Now, I'm sure y'all have experiences like this every day, right? Like a crazy story, right? This is like a M. Night Shyamalan movie kind of thing going on there. Scary stuff. I have to give a shout out to my son Cameron, who actually today moves into his new school. He's going to Cedarville University. And I appreciate some of y'all been praying for him because his school shut down, Cincinnati Christian University. And so we found out literally Thursday he has to move in today. It's crazy stuff. So we have a big day ahead. But it's been really cool to watch how the Lord has been preparing him for me. He's feeling a call into ministry. And so the tides are shifting when your son comes to you and says, got a book I want to recommend to you, Dad. So he recommended this book to me. It's called Forgotten Jesus. It's written by Robbie Gallaty, which actually is a guy I really like. He pastored a church for years in Chattanooga. He may still be there. And he's kind of known as a bit of a discipleship guru. He does a lot of training conferences regarding discipleship. I've read one of the other books he'd written, but not this one. He wrote the book to help us Western Hemisphere, modern day Americans remember that Jesus from birth to death was raised as a good Jew. Jewish infant, Jewish child, Jewish young man, Jewish man. And we often miss some of the subtle things in Scripture because we see everything through our eyes, which is normal, right? But we don't know a lot about how a Jewish boy was raised and how he might see things. So it's a really intriguing book. One of the little nuggets in that book talks about this encounter that Jesus had. And I learned something that I did not know. Back in the first century, exorcisms weren't that uncommon. You know, whenever I heard the story, and there's multiples of Jesus performing an exorcism, casting out a demon, when I would hear those stories, I would call them miracles just based on the fact that Jesus did something that only Jesus could do. But the truth of the matter is that there were actually people before Jesus came onto the scene that would perform exorcisms. They actually had trainings for performing exorcisms. It's interesting. Some of these scribes could have very well performed exorcisms as religious leaders, have done it before. Now, the training, one of the key points of the training of these ancient exorcisms, one of the things you had to do to perform it successfully was to determine the name of the evil spirit and command it by name to leave. And you may have heard about other incidences in scriptures where Jesus casts out a demon. There's one situation where he asks for the demon to identify himself, and he says, I am Legion, for we are many. Which, right? Get out of there. So that's one of the incidences that Jesus experienced. And so there's an example of how that happened, but apparently that was a very common practice in ancient first century exorcisms. They weren't super uncommon. One little side note, I've got friends on the mission field, on the foreign mission field. I hear more about these kinds of encounters happening there than here. And I don't know what that exactly means. There's a lot we can talk about that. That's a whole other thing. But I do believe this happens still today. Having said that, these exorcisms were things that were commonly done, not too unusual for another religious leader to be able to do it. But do you see why they were struggling? If you're trained to do this, and one of the most key components to performing a successful exorcism was to determine the name of the evil spirit and cast it out by its name. We got ourselves a little mute spirit here. This boy's not talking. The spirit's not talking. It's deaf and mute. So what do? Take it to these men who follow Jesus. They can do it. They take this boy to the disciples, and they couldn't do it. Here comes Jesus and Peter, James, and John alongside him. And there's a big kerfuffle going on here, apparently. And they have this conversation, and we'll go back to what Jesus said. He kind of was perturbed, honestly. I mean, oh, faithless generation, it's God. We are so not God, aren't we? I hope you know that already, but we are so not God, because you know what we would have done? We would have said, never fear, I am here. Jesus said, oh, faithless generation, and we'll get back to that in a moment, but he said that, seemed perturbed, and then he went to work, and he cast out this demon. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because it goes back to what we've been saying all along. Well, what we said earlier, not all along. We're going to be saying it all along, all year long, is that this is kind of our story, or at least it should be. And we're not unlike this father who is in this story, where we got a situation where we tried multiple things to no avail, and as far as we're concerned, this seems impossible. But we know that somewhere deep in our heart that there might be a little hope with God. And if we put ourselves in the skin of this dad, who I don't know how much he knew about Jesus, I don't know how much he had witnessed about Jesus, but he had witnessed and known enough to where he approached him and talked to him and said, if you can do something, have compassion on us. And Jesus almost, hey, Jesus is sarcastic. He said, if I can, all things are possible for anyone who believes. And it'd be easy to preach a sermon and say, how dare that dad, if you can do something, where was his faith? Hey, guess what? We are that dad, right? And I love what he said. He said, I believe, but help my unbelief. And I believe that's such a beautiful conversation to have with God when you face your impossibilities. To just say, God, if you can do something, and I do believe, but help my unbelief. That's a great thing to do, actually. And we see that Jesus did what probably most were saying, well, this is one of the exceptions to the rule, man. This demon can't talk. We can't determine its name. It's not going anywhere. We're so sorry. Sounds like he's been dealing with this from childhood anyway. It's not looking good. Prognosis is not great. I'm sorry. But then Jesus, being Jesus, because he actually is God, can do anything. And without calling it by name, he cast this demon out in front of everyone. They were amazed. And then, interestingly enough, the disciples, I don't know, I picture them walking away, going to the next village or whatever. And while they're walking, a couple of them come up to say, Jesus, why couldn't we do that? And you know what I would expect Jesus to say? I mean, it would be a huge tweetable thing for him to say it. It would make for great preaching. It'd be a mic drop kind of moment for Jesus, for him to simply respond and say, because you ain't me. I'm Jesus and you ain't. That's why. But instead, he surprises me. He surprises this group of disciples and hopefully surprises you too, and says something unusual. This situation, it's different. And this demon could only be cast out by prayer. Which I got a whole lot of things I want to ask about that. Like, so were people actually casting out demons without even praying before? Was that a common practice? I don't know. But he's saying only by prayer. And some of the ancient Greek manuscripts of this passage actually read with prayer and fasting. In fact, you might find that in your hard copy of your English Bible. It may include that word or at least put it in a footnote on the bottom of the page. This kind can only be handled, can only be dealt with by prayer and fasting. And if you're like me, here's going to be your temptation. I hear that and I'm like, New Year's, goals. I'm going to crush me some goals. I'm going to pray this many times a day. I'm going to pray this. I'm going to get a prayer streak going on, right? Every day I pray for this much, blah, blah. And we do all that. And part of me wants to say, please do that. That's great. That's awesome. But the problem with it is, like many of my other goals I face, they become really about me and what I've done. And that's not why Jesus said this kind can only be cast out because of prayer. Because you need to check a box and then I'll approve of you and then you can do this. We have to watch that because it's how we tend to do Christianity. It's how we tend to do God. We still somehow turn it to be about us and what we can do. And if I do those things, then he'll do his thing. That's not how it works whatsoever. In fact, I will go back to what he said at the beginning when it seems like Jesus is kind of perturbed, like, oh, faithless generation. Our problem, my problem, is that I define faithful and faithless differently than what Jesus is trying to say here. When I hear the word faithful, if I'm saying I'm faithful, I will tend to make that about I'm doing what I should be doing. That's faithful. I'll be a faithful dad, a faithful husband, a faithful man in my community, a faithful pastor. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Faithless, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's how we've defined it. It's again what I'm doing. That's not what Jesus is saying when he uses that word, oh faithless generation. A good, modern 2020s decade interpretation of the Greek there is this. Oh, self-sufficient generation. Oh, DIY, do-it-yourself generation. How long will I have to bear with you? That's what he's saying. And when you interpret it that way, it cuts to my heart because I'm all about DIY. I'm find a formula. I will do it myself. I will look up the YouTube video. I will Google. I will research. I will phone a friend. And then Sherry will say, have you prayed about it? I'm the pastor. I thought about that. No, sometimes I haven't. My fourth thing I thought of sometimes. Because we are a self-sufficient generation, a DIY generation. Now listen, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to do self-sufficient things and do some things yourself. It's not when I'm not trying to shoot all of that down. Set some goals, crush some goals. But I just want to tell you right now, the silver lining in the impossibilities is because sometimes, unless we ever have them, we will never rely on him. Because that's how we're wired in our flesh. We won't rely on him. So when you're facing a giant, like David did, when you're facing a Red Sea or an Egyptian army, like Moses and the Israelites did, when as a parent you're looking at your child and you can't do anything to help them, and they've been this way since childhood, and you're at your wit's end, the silver lining in all of those things is you have no more need for self-sufficiency, no more DIY. Where are you going to turn? To the one who created everything, who sustains everything, who rules everything, who can do anything. When I look back at 2019, there's some hard stuff too. Even though I would say great things. I got to experience my mother-in-law being diagnosed with cancer, but also experience her healing from it. And how God was glorified in that. I got a good friend who's been a part of this church since the moment I got here and probably decades before that, Jerry Harris, who went on to be with the Lord. And I feel the void of him not here because he's such a strong, godly man, godly leader. And we prayed for a miracle for his healing for mesothelioma, but we didn't get that answer. Well, we got that answer. It just wasn't on this side of eternity. God chose for his healing to be with him in his presence. But hindsight always gives you so much wisdom. I can tell you how God has been glorified way beyond my imagination through Jerry's passing that I would not have expected. And I can't wrap my mind logically around all of that. Why do some things result in this and why do other things result in that? Listen, I'm like you. I sometimes don't know the answer to that question. But the one thing I know is that Jesus is the answer. And he has never failed me in that. And I've gone through some tough stuff, some hard stuff, some dark stuff. I've failed, and sometimes I've succeeded. And through all of that, when it all comes down to it, I am nothing, and I have nothing, and I'm hopeless and joyless and void of love, real love, apart from this man, Jesus Christ. All things are possible with him. That's our theme for 2020. You're going to hear it over and over again. My goal is that you'll be sick of that sentence in 2020. All things are possible with him. And that's why he said to pray. That's the only way that demon was going to run is if you spent time praying, because you're talking to the one who can do anything. And when you talk to the one consistently who can do anything, and you find yourself in intimate relationship with the one who can do anything, then you can face anything. And you will trust no matter what, even if it doesn't make sense. I don't know about you, but that's what I want this year. That's what I'm going to strive for this year. So I want to give you a couple little things that I believe are going to happen in 2020. I'm praying for them to happen. And one thing, I don't know if it'll happen or not, but it might. And I believe that God desires it to happen. And I believe he wants to use us to make it happen. And that is 100 baptisms in 2020. Isn't that original? You know, we went through all the trouble to create this wooden thing. We're going to use it again in 2020. I don't know about you, but if you were here very much at all in 2019, the weirdest thing, the first time I walked into this room this morning, the first thing that stood out was, hey, somebody forgot to turn that light bulb board on. It weirded me out because we've seen it lit for so long throughout the year. And I'm like, oh, that's right, it's a new year. We've got to start all over. More bulbs to light. Next hour, first bulb will be lit in 11:30 hour. We'll have a baptism. Isn't that awesome? That's why we're going to start 2020. But I'm praying for that. Listen, this isn't original. I have a friend who pastors a church in Bowling Green, Kentucky. His name is Steve Ayers. He's been there forever. He is like the total opposite personality as me, but I really love hearing his thoughts on things. They have a very large church there. They, for years, over and over again, prayed for 600 baptisms. And it took them years to meet it. They met it in 2018, and it's pretty awesome. They had a big celebration about that. I want to tell you more about that story in just a moment, but this is what I want us to be praying for and trusting in God for and asking him to even use us to make happen. There's another thing we're going to do in 2020, and I'm not going to launch it till March 1st, actually, and it's going to be a 40-day fast. Now, don't wig out if you've never heard of that and don't know what that is, or if you have heard of it and you're like, oh, I'm in the wrong church this morning. Not going to do that. So we're not eating for 40 days? All right, wrong church. We did a 21-day fast at the beginning of the year last year. And if you were here in a part of that, you know there's lots of ways to do fasting. Most of them aren't total abstinence from all food and drink for sure. There are lots of ways to do it. So stay tuned. We'll give you some more information on what that could look like for you. But the point of fasting is to deprive yourself of something that you consistently, normally consume or experience. And that void that is created by that deprivation is filled with your focus on the one who provides all your needs. That's the whole point of that. And if you've never been a part of doing something like that, get ready for your heart and mind to be blown by doing it. Everybody I know who's ever experienced it said, wow, God did something. God taught me something. So we're not going to launch it till March 1st, and we will end it with Easter Sunday. Easter, whatever you gave up, you can actually bring it back on Easter Sunday. That's going to be great, right? Celebrate the resurrection and celebrate breaking the fast. But the whole point of that is throughout that whole time period, we're going to be in a sermon series called All Things Possible. We're going to look at impossibilities that God did in the Bible, but you're going to hear personal stories of people you're sitting next to share their story of what God has done that's impossible. I can't wait to experience that with you. So what do we do today? I want to invite you into this next step. Two of them, really. One of them is not going to be on the screen. Because we've been talking about God doing the impossible, and you probably already had this conjure up in your mind or in your heart. But answer this question, if you haven't already. What impossibility stands before you right now? And if you're thinking logically like, oh, Bill, you just said all things are possible with him, so technically nothing. Don't be squirrely. You know what I'm talking about here. David was pretty confident that the giant was going to go down. But tell that to the army who had sat there for I don't know how long getting shaken in their boots about him, right? He was still a big, armored, 9-foot dude. What is your impossibility that's before you right now? My encouragement to you today is to just do what this dad did. Jesus, can you do something? I believe. But help my unbelief and see what he does. But I want to set our eyes in the right direction as we start this new year. You know, I believe with all my heart, the reason God has done great things and did great things in 2019 is because we have committed to be a church that doesn't look at ourselves too much. We look outside these walls and say, God has us here to make a difference out there. And so the next step I want you to consider today is this, to pray for God to do the impossible in someone else's life. And maybe you already thought about that, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, a classmate, a teammate. Maybe that's already come up in your mind like this. I can't think of an impossibility right off the top of my head for me, but I immediately went to this person I care about and what they're facing. That's fine. Pray for that. But I'm going to even give you something more specific. In a moment when we sing this closing worship song, if you want to commit to praying for one of the people that are going to turn on one of these bulbs this year, I invite you to come to one of these high top tables. We have 3 of them here. We have one in the balcony. And literally sign up to pray for one of these bulbs. For not one of the bulbs, for one of those people, one of those souls. This is what Hillview Heights did in Bowling Green. They shared a great story about that. I'm holding up one of the cards. It just has our little logo. It says 79 of 100, and it says baptisms. And we have a sheet here where you write your name, your email address, and which number you took. You may be wondering, why do that? I'll tell you why. This is a cool story. They did this at Hillview Heights down in Bowling Green. And one of the years that they were doing this, one of the ladies took one of these and was praying all year round. And later in that year, turns out the number she had been praying for was her own grandson, who ended up accepting Christ into his heart, being baptized, and being able to turn on their bulb. Actually, I don't know if they did bulbs. Scratch that. That was that number of baptism. For us, that's the kind of stories God wants to write. And what you're praying for isn't about a bulb, about an act of baptism. You're praying for a soul who needs to take their next step with Jesus. You don't even know who they are. The reason I think it's important to do this is because of this. I've had people tell me, and I felt this way, where I've looked at a situation, I'm like, this person is far from God, and their situation seems impossible. No, it ain't. As long as we're breathing God's good air and have a prayer in our heart, nothing is impossible with God. You may be praying for someone's uncle, grandma, grandpa, niece, nephew, child, someone who's never even been to church in their lives that's going to come here later this year. And you are making a difference in that person's life starting today if you just take a card and pray. So I ask you, would you be willing to commit to praying consistently for one of these numbers, one of these souls that's going to be taking the next step with Jesus in 2020? That's the next step I invite you to. And as we prepare to do that together, will you bow with me in prayer? Lord, we come to you being reminded that you say that some situations require prayer. This kind of evil spirit could only be cast away by prayer. And Lord, how I'm so guilty of not realizing that some of my circumstances, some of my impossibilities are the same way. I try everything but lean upon you. I make you my last resort. And sometimes I pray, but I'm praying more about me more than I am about you. And I don't do it with faith. Instead, I just do it because it's what I do. Starting today, Lord, I pray that you would burden our hearts with this idea of just trusting you, believing in you, really believing in you. And Lord, you've given us this opportunity to commit to praying for a soul that will come to know you as their Savior and Lord, and ultimately declare that faith through baptism. Lord, if you, whoever it is in this room, you're calling to do that, give them the courage to step out and come take one of these cards and sign up for it. Lord, move us to believe. Help our unbelief. And use us to reach the lost for you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.